Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can hear us. Who are we? There we are. We may have surmounted immense difficulties. I want you all to say a prayer for Jasmine in Delhi, India. She is the tech support person I got when I went to Dell support. My computer would not boot up this morning. And she took me through the thing. It was great. And Joseph, I think you've got your speaker on or you got your Outlook on. But in any event,
you do.
We're back. No, because I don't think it comes through from me. Anyway, we're back.
Nothing on except you, Father.
Except me? Okay, maybe I'm the problem. That's happened in the past. So we're going to conclude our discussion on this wonderful book, Literature, What Every Catholic Should Know. And there will be some fireworks, and I'm predicting fireworks towards the end here.
Fireworks on the way.
Oh, good.
So, by now, I hope you're watching this every week, so you know that Joseph Pearce is here as our esteemed leader, who, however, in humbleness, he empties himself to allow me to start the show because it's on my computer. Father Festio here, Vivan Dudro. Shall we start? 147, Belloc, Chesterton,
And Benson.
And Benson, Belloc, and Chesterton. Joseph?
Well, yes. So obviously, I wanted the books going chronologically from the Greeks right through to the 20th century. And Chesterton was first published in 1900, Belloc in 1896, and Benson, I think, 1903. So if you're going to start the 20th century, it's basically the best place to start is with those three. And I snuck Maurice Baring in there at the end, even though he's not got title billing.
So now, do you think because you are a British citizen that you're at all biased in terms of suggesting all these English authors?
Well, if you look carefully, there's a cryptic message there because Benson, Belloc, and Chesterton spells BBC, Father. I think there's a bias in there somewhere.
I did actually notice that, yes.
Well, and it also follows your interests as well a little bit, but that's okay. Everybody has their interests, and
well, yeah, and I think in terms of the influence on the Catholic literary revival, the period of the Chester Belloc from 1900, when Chesterton was first published, to Chesterton's death in 1936, is beyond doubt. So I think to have a literature what every Catholic should know without spending due attention on those two would be definitely a sin of omission on my part. And as for Benson, one can argue about whether he should be considered a major novelist in a broader sense, but I think in a Catholic sense, that he's written several novels that are very significant that I think Catholics should know, and it's literature what every Catholic should know. So at least Catholics should know about Benson, and that's what this book will ensure that they do now.
Right, and I think in a certain sense, because we're publishing this book in an English language, it kind of implies what every Catholic should know who reads English. I mean, it may be that we want to spend more time on the French or the German or the Russian or whatever, but in fact, in our cultural area,
yes,
for the first part of the 20th century, I mean, these were the giants, and there were no other giants really to speak of.
Well, and we do live the Catholic revival. When we talk about the Catholic revival, which we might say started with soon-to-be Saint John Henry Newman's conversion in 1845, but that Catholic revival was in the English-speaking world, really, from Newman onwards, and that's really what we're speaking about. But of course, I don't want to suggest there aren't good Catholic literature in other languages. But I would also say that what T.S. Eliot said, and I think we may have said this before in other contexts, that between the potency and existence falls the shadow, and works in translation, especially poetry in translation, something's always lost anyway. So I think it's correct for us, if you like, give due deference to our own native tongue.
Well, I'm thinking also, I spent 3 or 4 years in France back in the middle of the 20th century or a little after that. And, there was a tremendous Catholic influence in literature, Blois, Claudel, Péguy, Mauriac. I mean, they were pardon me?
Bernanos.
And Bernanos also. I would say Bernanos because in French you always pronounce the last syllable. But anyway, yes. And we're giving a little less time to them But again, most
Although I would say that I think all, but certainly almost all of those were mentioned in the chapter on French literature, which we looked at
that's
last
true.
week. I
Right, they
actually
are
tagged
mentioned.
the 19th and the 20th century with the French literature chapter, and I think all of those are mentioned, certainly all but one.
All right, very good. So, what do you want to say about Benson?
Well, I do
About
think that
Belloc?
I do think Lord of the World, that his dystopian futuristic novel, is a novel that Catholics should know, and I do think it stands shoulder to shoulder beside Brave New World by Aldous Huxley and 1984 by George Orwell. And I actually think, in terms of prophecy, even though it was the first of those three to be written, is actually the most prophetic, because it's really about a rise of a sort of secularist you a secularist regime which talks about peace, talks about love. The natural fact, of course, is a soft tyranny, and that's certainly coming to pass a century on from when it was written. Um,
That
and,
seems
and
that seems so far from reality, Joseph. I mean, really.
it's far fetched. It's definitely far fetched, right?
All right. Now Belloc, and I think you're more Bellocian than Chestertonian, Joseph. Uh,
Well, I must say,
I'm not saying that as a criticism at all. I just think that
well, good, good. I mean, if one is forced, so there's a difference between best and favorite. We've discussed this as well. I know in the book club in the past. I'm not saying that Belloc is better than Chesterton, but I do find my sympathies move in his direction. Just as a person, I think he's more robust. He's more masculine. He hikes. And I like to do all those things. So yeah, I suppose that there is an affinity between me and Belloc, certainly. But I owe more to Chesterton than I do for Belloc as regards my conversion, although they were both very significant.
yes, and I think I mean really every Catholic should know something of both of them.
Hmm.
Yes.
I know years ago at Ignatius Press, I'm not sure you're there yet, Vivian, but in Old Taverna there, we had dinners every once a week in the evening. We used to have reading at table, and we started on Belloc's, historical writings on the French Revolution, Danton, others, Robespierre, and then his ones on the English Revolution. And I mean, he's a historian that makes you want to read history.
Yes. Well, that's because he's a great prose stylist. I mean, Belloc and Chesterton are men of letters, and same as Newman. That doesn't matter what they're writing. Whether they're writing history, philosophy, theology, fiction, non-fiction, essays. That because their writing style is so beautiful, we just enjoy reading them and being with them.
Hmm.
Right. Another thing I like about Belloc in his historical writings, he was a military historian too, but he went and got the weather reports, for the different days in these wars, and just said, well, yeah, of course, this was a difficult battle because it was raining that morning.
Right.
What
And he would actually walk the terrain. He'd visit the battlefields in situ. Would
he
actually
walked
walk
them
the
all,
terrain
yeah,
to visualize it. So to incarnate what was happening, rather than having the whole thing just on paper.
yeah. I think his characters of the Reformation, of course, I think is a classic which everyone should read,
Which we republished.
which we republished at
Mhm.
Ignatius Press, Ignatius.com. Don't forget that. But before that, your Catholic bookstore, local Catholic bookstores, please support them.
Hmm.
Anything else on Belloc we should say?
Well, we could speak forever on Belloc, but
I
obviously
know.
we've got
No, we
to
should
be
move on.
proportionate. So
Let's move on to G.K. Chesterton. And of course, you can say more about him, I think, even than Belloc. I mean, certainly, I think one of the great minds, Catholic minds of all time, one of the great Catholic writers, and one of the great Catholic persons. And I am for canonizing G.K. Chesterton. I mean, for God's sake, we canonize every Italian midwife and bicyclist.
And
We finally get around to Newman, but Chesterton, if he's not a saint, then we're all in trouble.
yeah,
Well, one thing I would say is that obviously what the obstacle has been the inertia of the English hierarchy. And I don't think Newman would ever have been canonized by the English hierarchy. What it took was two separate Americans praying to him and receiving miracles. So maybe we should just practice what we preach here and start praying to Chesterton for miracles and just bypass the hierarchy.
Well, yeah, Chesterton is a miracle. He's 2 or 3 miracles. I mean, some person gets cured from liver cancer, that's a miracle. And he writes Everlasting Man, that's not a miracle. I'm sorry.
I'm with you. I'm with you. You're preaching to the converted, Father.
What does that mean? There's a very ominous message on. Oh, there it goes.
No, it's good.
It's
It
good.
was,
Okay.
That was my tech support person from India. The thing was closed out.
Okay.
She was great.
Well, we might alert our watchers and readers that there's a whole section of episodes on Chesterton. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on him as much as he deserves it, because we've got several, we did the whole book on him, remember? Just a little while ago.
Light of the Holy Ghost, Dal
Yes.
Alquist. We did
Yes.
indeed, yes.
Oh, that's right. That's
Yes,
true. Okay.
yes. So
All right.
if we're going
When are we going to schedule the next one then, Vivian?
well, I'm happy to go through the chapter by chapter. Your chapter on Sassoon and Eliot, T.S. Eliot, were very good.
We missed Bering here.
Oh, sorry.
Only a page and a half, a page on Bering, but that's okay. He should be read, I think, but definitely he's in a little bit of a shadow of Belloc and Chesterton, I would say.
Yeah, but I think he's unjustly neglected, partly because he's difficult, and that's not because he's a bad writer or too deep. I think we become very shallow. And I think that that 70 or 80 years on after he wrote his novels between the two world wars, we live in an illiterate age now that just can't cope with the depth of culture that he's coming from. And he's a polyglot. He speaks about 5 or 6 different languages. He interweaves all of that knowledge into the fabric of his plots. It's hard going. And we live in a lazy and illiterate age. And I think so the key thing, I think, is that Bering is neglected, not because he doesn't warrant being read, but because we're no longer able to read him.
Well, that reminds me of what the poem that Lewis thought was the best poem of the 20th century was Taliesin Through Logres by Charles Williams, but no one can understand it. It wasn't finished. But then you also have David Jones, whose book is not phenomenal, but he's a Welshman. And I mean, it's like reading another language.
Nobody understands the Welsh, Father.
Well, and that sort of is my segue into T.S. Eliot, because he also is not an easy poet to read. And unlike Sassoon, his poetry is easy to read, not because the subject matter is easy. His war poetry is about very brutal realities, but his style of writing is simpler and more accessible with neat and tidy rhyming lines and that kind of
thing. I think Eliot's deliberately playing hide and seek, and Sassoon's quite happy for us to understand what he's trying to say up front. And two different approaches, they're both legitimate, but obviously it makes one much more difficult to understand than the other.
Yes, and Eliot's almost deliberately being hard to understand, right? That's part of his approach, his genius. But I think he's worth the trouble of trying to understand him.
I will agree with you, but before I agree with you, let me give a little background here. I'm kind of a Philistine when it comes to poetry. If I can't understand it by reading it, then I don't want to go any further, And I felt that way about Eliot. I was happy to find out that C.S. Lewis did not like T.S. Eliot's poetry, and Lewis called himself the last medieval man. He said he doesn't like these poems that don't have rhythm and don't rhyme as well and everything, Well, then I got in a conversation with Thomas Howard. God bless that man.
Yes.
And he was at Casa Balthasar in Rome in the summer, and he gave a little seminar on the 4 quartets. And it completely opened it up. I said, oh my, this is marvelous, magnificent. But the thing is, I needed Tom Howard to show me how to understand that poem. So I agree that T.S. Eliot is someone we should all know, but you may need a guide.
Right, you may need a guide, but also I think some of his images and the use of his language is just masterful. And even if you don't understand it initially, it's still a joy to read this kind of command of the language, this ability to put in front of you something so vivid and evocative, even if you don't at first understand it. And Joseph, I think you did a really good job of opening up Eliot to the reader in your chapter.
Well, thank you. I have taught 4 quartets, but a long while ago, and not in as much depth as Thomas Howard understands it. But I've taught The Wasteland to undergraduates many times in my 20th century literature classes at Ave Maria and elsewhere. So it's a poem I know well and I love greatly. But you're completely correct. Anybody who reads that for the first time by themselves, is going to be confused. But you can say the same thing about The Wreck of the Deutschland by Hopkins. You can say the same thing about The Man Who Was Thursday by Chesterton. So a work of literature can be difficult, doesn't mean that it's bad, but just because it's difficult.
Right, right. So then on the next chapter, Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene and Brideshead Revisited. That should be on every Catholic's list of novels to read.
And on that, do you think, how important is it to watch the film version of that, or that big 8-hour thing?
Well, the one done
which
by
I didn't see.
The one done by the BBC is excellent. And Joseph, you mentioned that in here, that it's very faithful to the story. And
probably, Vivian, the only time I'm guessing that I mentioned a film adaptation of a work of literature, because generally speaking, they make a real bad job of it, and at best, at worst, they're actually deliberately poisoning and inverting the meaning. But that British TV adaptation of Brideshead is just absolutely sublime. All of it. It's about 11 hours, and it really goes scene by scene. The characters are really brought to life. Great acting. I would recommend it. Definitely.
I would too. I would say that I don't agree with you that generally the things are badly done, but however, it's certainly true in the case of the recent film adaptation with Emma Thompson and don't remember the other cast of characters, but I never saw it. This is secondhand information, but from the people who did see it and reviewed it, I decided I wasn't going to watch it. I thought it would spoil.
Well, actually, Vivian, what made me definitely decide not to watch it was the producer of that version said that in his version, God is the enemy, which is actually deliberately inverting and perverting Waugh's whole theme. But I tell you what, I think it's a providential snippet, because there's one scene in Brideshead Revisited that everybody does need to read. And I've never managed to read it to my students without my voice cracking, and that's the death scene of Lord Marshmain in the novel. And as providence as that would have it, I was actually in a hotel room flicking through the channels on the TV. We don't have a TV at home, so I tend to indulge myself when I'm away from home. Flicking through the channels, and I came on this new Brideshead Revisited right at the moment of Lord Marshmain's death, and it's not that the focus is not on him. It's not on his conversion. It's on Charles and Julia, and Julia's just angry. The faith has made her angry, and it's ripped them apart. That beautiful love they have is ripped apart because of the church. This was all conveyed in about 20 seconds, and I clicked the button. I thought, I've seen enough.
Yeah. Now I do take a little bit of a different view here, Joseph, on Lady Marshmain, the character of Lady Marshmain.
What page are you
on? 173.
Okay.
You say, from a worldly perspective, it's easy to find in Lady Marshmain a convenient scapegoat whose relentless adherence to the faith has alienated her husband and children from herself and her religion. This is indeed the way the novel is often read and taught, and so on. And then God, the enemy. But I think surely her character has played a part in the dynamics of the family, which is not to say that she's to blame for her husband's adultery or her son's alcoholism or her other child's waywardness. No, but as we all know, truth be told about families being the way they are, that even the best of mothers can take the wrong approach to this or that child, right? And there's some very, very painful scenes, where she's trying to bring out the best in her children. And she's using the example of the fallen soldier brother of hers who dies in World War I. And of course, she has in her mind, he's this idealized man, he's a hero, a war hero. I mean, who can live up to this vision of manhood? Very few. And she doesn't realize the crushing shame that she is piling on top of her own children by constantly bringing to the forefront the virtue of this dead man. I mean, and it's painful to read, and then it's painful to watch.
Well, if I could say, if I say one or two things on that. First of all, the dead men were her two older brothers, both killed during World War One.
Yes.
And we mustn't overstress that, because she does have their photographs. She gets a book written about them, and so clearly she's haunted by the death of her older brothers during the war, which is entirely understandable.
Yes.
And the psychological repercussions of that, we have to be careful not to overstate them. Although I'm not disagreeing with you, I just think that it has to be kept in proportion. Let me tell you how I handle this when I teach the class. I don't think I mentioned this in the book. My usual paper prompt when I teach Brideshead is Lady Marshmain, innocent or guilty. And what they have to do, the students have to do, is to give the case for the defense, the case for the prosecution, and then the verdict. So I do make sure that my students know both sides of the story. Lady Marshmain, a villain. Lady Marshmain, I don't think anyone suggested she's a saint. But the key thing is the voices. I mean, who's saying it? And often the Lady Marshmain sees the bad light because of what Julia and Sebastian are saying about her. And so again, it's the voice is important, and the most authoritative voice, if you want to put it this way, in the novel is the perspective of the older Charles Ryder, the middle-aged Charles Ryder, who's telling the story, and it's quite clear that he's on the verge of conversion to Catholicism, and he says that he only has one reproach to her for all of her abundant kindness, and that was when she unconsciously drove a wedge between him and Sebastian. So again, the only reproach he has for all of her abundant kindness is when she unwittingly does something. And so I'm not trying to paint her white at all, but I do think that she gets a bad rap, and I'm trying to address the balance.
Well, she does. I agree with you that she gets a bad rap by the people who don't want to take Waugh at his word that he's writing a story about God's grace operative in the lives of people. That's what Waugh says he's doing. And for all the critics out there and filmmakers out there who want to do something else with his story and turn her religion into the villain, I'm not having anything to do with that. But coming from a family full of alcoholics, drug addicts, psychotics, lunatics, and suicides, I know a little bit about family dynamics and my own experience raising four now grown children, and seeing all the different personality types and all the different personality interactions and all the dynamics that go on in families. I think Waugh has done a very beautiful and ambitious job of bringing all this out into the light, not with condemnation, not with trying to pick bad guys and good guys, but just showing a family and how these relationships work themselves out over time. That's all. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to turn her into a villain. I'm not trying to turn her into a ogre. I'm just saying I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I get it.
Well,
I get it.
Many years ago, I was stopped by this conference in Seattle. It was on the permanent things, I think. It was a Lewis Tolkien type group. And there was a professor whom I won't name from a wonderful Catholic university I won't name, who was speaking on professor of literature. And he claimed it was not a Catholic novel because it was full of depravity. And I, who am not much for literature, said, wait a second. Mm-hmm. To me, it's a deeply Catholic novel.
Yeah.
There's redemption there.
On that topic, I'd like to quote Flannery O'Connor, who talks about what the job of the Catholic novelist is, if I may. She says that every serious novelist is trying to portray reality. Now, that strikes some people as odd, right? Why would you use fiction to portray reality? But that's exactly what the good novelist is trying to do. As it manifests itself in our concrete, sensual life. And he cannot do this unless he's been given the talent. Okay, some people try to write and they don't have the talent to do it. So then she goes on to say that this reality that the novelist is trying to look at is not only concerned with the good in them, but with the evil. And not only with the evil, but also with that aspect which appears neither good nor evil, which is not yet Christianized. And this is what you've talked about so much, Joseph, you know, the pagan imagination, right? That's still looking for the truth. But then she says that the Catholic novelist in particular doesn't have to be a saint. He doesn't even have to be a Catholic. He does, unfortunately, have to be a novelist. And what she means by that is somebody who, first of all, looks at what really is there, then sees what he looks at, and then tries to use the power of his command over the language to make a believable world where he's recreating what he has looked at and what he's seen. And that's not always going to be the pretty, good, happy, sweetness and light things, is it? It's
if you're going to depict sin in a work of fiction, you have to depict it for what it is, and sin is depraved. So therefore, if you're going to talk about sin in a work of fiction, you're going to have depravity.
Yes.
If you're not going to have depravity, you're not going to actually depict the truth as it is. You're going to have a saccharine coated sort of cheap hagiography version of the world, which may or may not be appropriate as a way of telling us about the saints. It certainly isn't a way of telling us about the rest of us who aren't saints.
Well, then she actually, that's one essay. In another essay, she talks about the Catholic reader. She said, if the average Catholic reader could be tracked down through the swamps of letters to the editor and other places where he momentarily reveals himself, I might add now blogs and Twitter and all the other places people opine these days, he would be found to be something of a Manichaean. Now remember, this is Flannery O'Connor. By separating nature and grace as much as possible, he, the average Catholic reader, has reduced his conception of the supernatural to pious cliché and has become able to recognize nature in literature in only two forms, the sentimental and the obscene. He would seem to prefer the former, while being more of an authority on the latter. And then she just plows through sentimentality like I've never read before. Okay, so anyway, this great lady and great author, I think, is worth reading and consider. What does every Catholic need to know about literature? They need to read people like this to get a more mature view of what literature is, and
certainly, as regards Flannery O'Connor, people do need to know that if they read her nonfiction, so yeah, her criticism, which you've just been reading from there, and also her letters, in conjunction with dovetailing with her fiction, they'll actually see the fullness of the person and understand more easily what she's trying to achieve in her short stories and her two novels.
Because quite frankly, a lot of the Catholics in her day, they didn't understand her. They didn't want to understand her. She was written up badly in Catholic periodicals. A lot of people thought that she had to be depraved to write the way she did. And so this is her revenge, I suppose. But that brings us really to Graham Greene. And I actually strenuously disagree with your take on Greene.
Well, I knew you would.
You did? Is that why you did it?
That's exactly why I wrote it, Vivian. No, as soon as you said fireworks, I thought, right, now 20th century, where's that going to be? Well, certainly Graham Greene. She's definitely going to have a go at me for my take on Graham Greene.
Yes. Because what you say here, I must say, I think you've gone too far here, where you say, if Greene's faith, this is page 175, if Greene's faith can be seen to be genuine, if it does not alter the fact that his practice of the faith and his expression of it in his works was at best enigmatic and at worst downright disreputable and heretical. Oh, Joseph, I think you've really done Graham Greene a injustice. I really do.
Well, that's fine, but I'm really echoing the words of people such as Evelyn Waugh, who knew him well as a friend, who certainly is a very good Catholic and a very good novelist. So I'm certainly not alone. This is not my putting my head out on a limb here. I'm expressing a viewpoint, and I do think that there's too much reverence shown to Graham Greene sometimes, particularly in his later novels, where he's deliberately flirting with heresy, even if he's not committing it.
Well, I just don't agree. And his Power and Glory, I've read like 3 times. It's a masterful work. And
it is. It's a masterful work of fiction, but I don't think that the Whiskey Priest is believable as a character.
You don't? You should.
No, I don't believe anybody.
My house.
I don't believe anybody can be that much of a loser and actually do what he did. In other words, that there's no real sign anywhere in the novel of him having any genuine love for Jesus Christ, for the church, or even for his parishioners, and yet he doggedly continues to do his duty. Now, if people do not actually have any sensibility towards God and neighbor, they don't do their duty. They run away. In other words, the courage that he shows is not congruent with his philosophy of life and his emotion.
The courage that he shows is, I agree with you, not believable out of a man full of weakness and sin as he is. So where does that courage come from? It's coming from God. And this.
So we're not possessed. So Vivian, we're not possessed by God. Always there's a relationship, a loving relationship going on by the grace that we receive from God and our response to it. The Whiskey Priest shows nothing but basically hating the fact that he's where he is, hating. No, there's no suggestion anyway. In fact, I would challenge you to find anywhere in the whole novel where the Whiskey Priest says anything positive about Jesus Christ, or indeed the church, or indeed, for that matter, any human being.
Well, I just don't know what to say. I mean, wow, okay. I mean, God's grace is manifested in weakness, St. Paul says. And this story, and so many of other Greene stories, which are dealing with deeply, deeply conflicted men who are spies and don't tell the truth.
I have no problem with conflict. What I find in the Whiskey Priest is the absence of conflict. He surrendered from page 1 and stays in a state of surrender to the moment he dies, which even then it's a surrender, not to the surrender of the will of God, but just a surrender to the circumstances.
Well, that's page 1, and I don't know the novels. I've read it years and years ago. However, I've often thought this about priests that I know who I question sometimes. They became priests. What led them to become priests? There was something there. There's something in their heart, something in their soul, and that may have totally covered over it, what they've become. But maybe it's not dead yet. So, I mean, I don't, again, I can't speak.
Yeah.
Right, but Father, let's think about this, that when priests lose their faith, when priests no longer have a love for Jesus Christ or his church, and when they cease to have a real love for their congregation, what happens? They become corrupt, and we've seen that all over the place now. And that's my argument: is that the Whiskey Priest is so corrupt, it's not really believable that he would do what he's doing, because he would actually be doing far worse things.
You just don't know enough corrupt people.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry. You need to get out more. Maybe.
What about the good thief? I
just.
The good thief repents moments before his death, and that's absolutely wonderful. And the Whiskey Priest could do the same thing as the good thief, but he doesn't. In actual fact, you compare the words of the good thief to Christ at the moment of his death with the last thoughts of the Whiskey Priest is about to be killed. And again, that will show the difference.
Well, okay.
He's a good priest. I'm not going to respond to the fact that I don't know depravity. I've been about a bit.
No, I know, but sometimes, anyway, I know you have a past. We all do. You might want to read just to soften your heart a little bit toward Graham Greene. You might read his hint of an explanation. Have you read this short story, which is one of the
Yes.
beautiful
It's beautiful.
pieces
It's
of the
beautiful,
Eucharist?
it's absolutely beautiful. And I don't mention it in the book because I don't mention it all. I love that short story. Perhaps I should have mentioned it in the book. And when I'm criticizing the power and the glory, and criticizing aspects of Greene's approach to writing, which are his words, not mine, that all I'm doing is, and deliberately doing, is giving a counterpoint to what I see as a hagiographical approach towards him by many Catholics.
Well, I'm not making the man a saint by any means, but to savage him the way you do, I just thought that needed to be pointed out.
Well, this is good, but the good thing is that you people out there, we're having a book club discussion.
This is what clubs
what
are
this
due.
means is that you ought to be reading this and joining the discussion.
Yes.
Because it's worth discussing. I mean, whether whoever's right here or neither one of you is right or both of you are right, however, you include them in the book because this is something a Catholic should know about.
Yes.
Yeah, and I certainly couldn't leave Graham Greene out, and nor would I want to, because he's a great storyteller. He's a great writer. And I think Norman Sherry wrote to me. Norman Sherry is Graham Greene's official biographer. He wrote a 3-volume biography of Graham Greene and knew him well. He wrote to me and said that I believe that Greene was and remained a committed Catholic until his death, and I believe that. And I'm not stating, and I certainly didn't mean to state that he's not a Catholic, or that he's a heretic. I think he flirts with heresy. I think he gets, and sometimes an almost diabolical pleasure out of flirting with heresy. And I wanted to give that counterpoint. I thought it was necessary. But I can see that. I know the points in the book that are going to be controversial. Obviously, we've already had a good to and fro about Milton. And I knew that Graham Greene would be another flashpoint, another place for fireworks. And yeah, hey, look, we all like fireworks.
Yes, that's right.
All right.
Well, Sigrid Undset, your next chapter, really a giant of literature, and as you point out, a convert. And what you don't point out, all of her novels and shorter works are revisiting the same theme over and over, not unlike Graham Greene revisiting adultery over and over. This is not a man who is making an argument for adultery, quite the opposite. Just by
hold on, you returned to Graham Greene here, which you're welcome to do, but I would argue, and I really could do this, I could write a whole book on the subject, don't tempt me, comparing Sigrid Undset and Graham Greene. Sigrid Undset always gets it right. I mean, she has sympathy for the sinner, she understands the weakness of human beings, but she never condones or gets some lascivious pleasure out of setting up scenarios where there's an ambiguity in the moral.
Well, that's not what I think Greene is doing. But Sigrid Undset, as you know from her own personal life, she broke up a man's marriage, ran off with him. She had quite a colorful past herself, and you can see her working out this plot line, if you will, in almost all of her female protagonists. Marrying badly for the wrong reasons, or shacking up with a guy for the wrong reasons. And now, but where does salvation come for all of these characters? It's actually in the suffering that brings about their redemption. And in fact, back to Flannery O'Connor here, she says that sentimentality is the desire for salvation without the cross. We want to jump from our fallen state back into a state of innocence through Christ, but not go through the purgation and suffering ourselves for the very things that we've done. There's just no way to get to a new innocence if you're not going to suffer for your sins. And that shows this so beautifully over and over and over again, that the very salvation of these individuals is precisely through the suffering of the consequences of what they've done, and not shying away from them, not blaming them and anyone else, but just plowing through them with grace. And I would also say, some people on Kristin Lavransdatter, that was the main trilogy of novels that Undset's the most famous for. And I've had people after reading the first one say, this is smut. And I've had to say, you know what? You got to read all 3 books. Joseph, this is a constant theme, isn't it? Dante, yeah. You got to read all 3 books. You can't stay in Inferno. And
No, absolutely, and it's certainly true that one thing that she's very good at, Sigrid Undset, is getting us to know and love the protagonist, getting us to know and love the sinner. So the first part of Kristen Lavensdatter is so painful to read because we actually like Kristen Lavensdatter. When we first see her when she's a little girl. So first of all, we're hooked, right? Because we're invested in this little girl, and we see her growing up and start to go wrong, and we sort of wincing and say, well, don't do that. If you do that, it's not going to be good. And then she does it, and then it's not good, right? And so the whole experience of that first novel is one of being skewered. So I can certainly understand why people say, no, I don't actually have to put myself through all this suffering. But you're completely correct. But if they persevere to the end, it's one of the most rewarding
it is.
stories that and what you say about you can't get through that renewed innocence except through the cross is absolutely correct, and that is what she's doing. And we
Yes.
do have to be prepared to take up our cross and follow her in this case, because in following her, we are following Christ.
Yes, it's brilliant. And you know that wincing that we do that you mentioned in the first book when we see this willful, headstrong girl and her father is a good man. You know, I mean, oftentimes the modern justification for rebellion, which by the way is Lucifer's justification for his rebellion in Paradise Lost, is that somehow the father has done me a bad turn, right? I'm justified in my rebellion because the father's been bad, right? Well, Lavrans is a good man.
Yes.
So Undset's not going to let you get away with justifying Kristen's rebellion by finding not that he's a perfect man by any means, but you're not going to be able to blame her rebellion on him. In fact, you're going to have to just look at her pride, which is the source of every downfall. And so when I was reading that and wincing, I was not only wincing because, like you, oh no, don't go there, this is going to end up badly, but I was just wincing at my own sins and how foolish I had been. And at the time, so deluded, thinking that I was justified in doing the things I did. You know, because my dad was, the old man, blah, blah, blah.
All right.
Yeah, she's great. I'm so glad you spent so much time on her, a whole chapter, in fact.
She warrants it, absolutely. I mean, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and unlike many of them, she thoroughly deserved it.
Now, the next chapter, 20th century American literature, and you begin with Willa Cather, who's absolutely brilliant. I would just like to back up a wee little bit and sneak in here Edith Wharton. She started publishing right after the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And even though she was not a Catholic, her view of human affairs and human actions is definitely a Catholic one, and she's definitely worth reading. It's painful to read her, like Edith. That's her name? Yeah, Edith Wharton is her name. But what's the most famous story from? Is the name of the protagonist? Anyway, it just doesn't get better than that in terms of the.
Yeah, no, I mean, I willing to plead that Edith Wharton as another sin of omission. As I can't remember, we talked about 19th century. I left somebody out in the 19th century English feminine genius. When you reprimanded me for leaving out George Eliot. I mean, I accept it's just impossible in a book of this length to incorporate everybody that warranted mention. And so, up to a point, I find myself wincing. But on the other hand, even looking back at things, I'm not sure I had much choice but to do what I did. And I don't. Yeah, I think it was unavoidable. Basically,
Of course.
leave writers out.
Of course, that's why I thought I would just sneak her in there because she's worth being there. And also, we neglected when we talked about 19th century American literature, we never mentioned Twain in our conversation. You mentioned him in the book, and you bring him up again here with his Joan of Arc, because you're making this comparison between Willa Cather and Mark Twain in being able to sort of enter the mind and imagination of these Catholic figures in a really brilliant way.
You have to respect and admire someone that can overcome their own prejudices and predilections and see something objectively and sympathetically. And I think
Yes.
that's what we see in Twain on St. Joan and Willa Catherine in her
Right.
Archbishop.
Yeah.
Right, but it's even more impressive in Twain because Twain was actually kind of anti-organized religion, whereas I don't think Willa Cather was.
No.
Also, she wrote another book called Shadows on the Rock about Quebec, which is a phenomenally good
Yes.
book about her heroism of the Catholics who founded Quebec.
Yes.
Very beautiful. And it always puzzled me that here she was not a Catholic, and she wrote so sympathetically and
Yes.
so positively about Catholic things.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, going back as well, I mean, that's what always surprises me about Longfellow's Evangeline. You know, that again, that the heroine is profoundly, devoutly Catholic. She ends up joining religious order. The other major hero of the whole narrative poem is a priest. And Longfellow's not a Catholic. So I really do admire it when we see that.
And Longfellow, at the end of his Hiawatha, the black robes come to the New World and bring the gospel. And so, yes, when you see that in people who have no Catholic allegiance or background, it's always a marvel.
Well, I said the historian Parker of, I think, the 19th century, whatever. I mean, he was writing the history of America, in the North America. He was a very serious Protestant. I mean, and almost an anti-Catholic Protestant. When he wrote about the Jesuits in North America, it was full of nothing but praise.
It's kind of hard not to praise a man who gets martyred like that and then comes back for more.
Yeah.
I mean, after being tortured the first time, comes back for more. So anyway, so then you move on to Walker Percy. And by the way, if you want to give a caveat, you need to give one about Walker Percy. I mean, his novels they can get pretty graphic on the sexual perversion side. In fact, I recommended a priest friend one time. I handed him one of my Walker Percy novels. Oh, you should read this. And that priest came back to me later and said, I will never take a book recommendation from you again. This book was a near occasion of sin. And I had read it and maybe I'm a woman. I'm not as sensitive to these things. I don't know. But anyway, you got to give a caveat when it comes to Percy. Because
I agree. I'm happy to turn the other cheek on that one with no problem whatsoever.
Oh, you're being very good today, Joseph.
All right.
You get the
I'm on my best behavior.
you get the take it like a man
We've
award
talked about
today.
Flannery already. I think we.
Yeah. Well, except maybe Joseph wants to say something brilliant about these Flannery stories that you chose.
I'm sure he wants to. But
Yeah,
I mean,
let's give him a
he's capable
chance.
of it.
Let's give him a chance because you have two stories in particular, Joseph. A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, and also
Well, the one. If you want me to say something briefly on Flannery, if you indulge me to choose, I would like to choose her novel, The Violent Bear It Away. And the reason for that is that the Christ figure in that is a child who I like to think has Down syndrome. It's certainly a child who is very mentally challenged, has all the traits of a child with Down syndrome. And obviously, I'm a father of a child with Downs. And I found this a very painful reading because he's abused basically by every other character in the novel. And of course, he's the innocent victim, which does make him a Christ figure in the work. And what you realize is that he's the only one actually who's not mad. I mean, all the other characters are basically maddened by their own selfishness into doing horrible things, not just with Bishop, the child with Downs, but to each other. And so for me, that's a perfect example of how we see someone who is, say with Down syndrome, who has, inverted commas here, nothing to contribute to society, who's actually the figure of Christ. And that paradox speaks very powerfully to me. And I wrote something fairly recently about Down syndrome, is that most of us are here to learn, but some of us are here to teach. Children with Down syndrome are here to teach. And Bishop, in that novel, teaches us all the most valuable lessons to be learned.
very beautiful.
So anybody who knows and likes Flannery O'Connor will have his own favorites, that's for sure. I would mention The Displaced Person, which is another Christ figure. And in fact, if you want to understand the crucifixion, how it happened, why it happened, who was responsible, and what they're thinking, that's the story that will do it. And then Parker's Back. Parker's Back is just I mean, they're all great,
They're all brilliant.
but I mean, those two are kind of top of my list. All right, we better get going. It's getting
Oh golly, yes,
late here.
we're getting away. And we'll end with the two. I know these are some of your favorites: Lewis, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien. I know this man in particular can't mention either.
That's the final chapter. That's the climax of the whole work, except for the
It
list of
is.
books at the end. And maybe we'll let Father wax lyrical or say something horrible to me about how I haven't done justice to C.S. Lewis.
Well, I mean, he was brilliant and he was very devout Christian. I think he was Catholic in his heart too. I mean, if he hadn't been born in Northern Ireland and had that prejudice, I don't see why he would not have become a Catholic. But he certainly there's nothing in his writing which is contrary to Catholic teaching. I mean, I'm talking about his fiction and his nonfiction.
Right.
People, I guess the two that are best known are Screwtape Letters, which she didn't like, and I don't either as well, and Narnia, which is wonderful, but it's children's tales for adults. It's got something to it, but I mean, I think his greatest novel was Till We Have Faces.
Well, he thought that too, and I agree with him.
I'm glad he agreed with me on that.
Well, I do actually agree with you, and C.S. Lewis would agree with you, and who am I to argue with either of you two? So maybe I'll just leave it there.
He also liked Perelandra, and I thought that was the best of the three of the space trilogy.
I disagree. That hideous strength beats Perelandra hands down. So you pushed a step too far, Father.
I think that's a genre question, maybe. Yeah.
I agree with you, Joseph.
Thank you, Vivian.
All right. Then also, but his nonfiction, I mean, an experimental literary criticism, the Miracles, I think, is one of the classic, most important books of the 20th century in terms of apologetics. Yeah. I taught that. I still handed it. I think Miracles and Everlasting Man, if you haven't read those, I mean, and you're over 25 years old, basically you go to confession. Chesterton, Tolkien.
What do you want to say about Lord of the Rings? I'd like to bring up, and this is not a problem I have, but people who've asked me this question, and I'm going to ask it to you as well. In Tolkien, you've got all of this, wizardry and sorcery and magic and all that, and as we know, the Dungeons and Dragons game and obsession sort of followed along Lord of the Rings. What do you have to say about people who are worried about reading this kind of thing?
Well, first of all, that Tolkien is very, very careful in the Lord of the Rings and elsewhere to distinguish between real magic and other things that people call magic, which aren't magic at all. So what he calls real magic is the sort of thing that Sauron does and Saruman does. It's the work of the alchemist. It's basically using a scientific view of the cosmos to make war on nature for personal empowerment. So he likens magic to medieval alchemy. In fact, he's really connecting it with scientism. Whereas Gandalf, for instance, is a servant of the secret fire. He's an angelic being, and his so-called magic is actually, we're just talking about miracles, is actually supernatural power that he gets because of his angelic being. So that's not magic in any sense we need to worry about. That's because elves and hobbits are the sort of so-called magic, and Tolkien's very, very careful to make sure we know this. It's not magic at all. It's something which is natural to them, which appears to be magical to us because we don't actually have that natural gift. And the analogy I sometimes use is if you look at the eyesight of an eagle. If we had the eyesight of an eagle, right, we would have magical powers. But it's not magical for an eagle to have that eyesight. It's natural to the eagle. So elves have certain powers that we don't have, but it's completely elvish and therefore natural to elves. It's not magic at all.
Did you like that?
That's good. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
The one difficulty I have is with people who don't like Lord of the Rings, but your daughter Mary, who's read much more than I've ever read.
She's probably read more than everyone combined in this room.
It's amazing. And she doesn't like it. And just we took my annual hike in the High Sierra this last weekend with Jim Holman, who's a wonderful Catholic layman in San Diego. You just can't get into Lord of the Rings. So I guess there has to be some, question of taste here. Although, as you pointed out, Joseph, I mean, it was voted both by the popular people and by the Folio Society, as the best book of the 20th century in England.
It's also the third largest selling work of fiction of all time, which you bear in mind it was only written 70 years ago is astonishing. The biggest selling is Don Quixote, and then the next is A Tale of Two Cities. The Lord of the Rings is third. And I would just finish, if you're going to finish on Tolkien, just by saying what Tolkien says, just in case.
Are you saying that Budweiser is the best beer then? Are you saying Budweiser is the best beer? Because it's the most selling beer.
The first thing I would say about that, you're accusing me of populism in a bad sense of the word here. That I would say that that it's the Don Quixote sold over 400 years, 500 years now, and that Budweiser, now that there's actually a choice and people have some real ale they can actually drink if they want with all these craft breweries, I predict that Budweiser's days are over.
Okay, well.
But yes, just to finish, maybe if we're going to wrap up our discussion here, I just want to. This is what I always say: if you want to encapsulate Tolkien in 30 seconds, is that Tolkien said, and I'm quoting him word for word here: "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously at first, consciously in the revision." And Tolkien was a lifelong practicing Catholic, and the date on which the ring was destroyed is March 25th. Which is the date of both the crucifixion and the Annunciation, and I'll let people work it out from there.
Right, and the fellowship was formed on December 25th.
It was, exactly.
Just a couple of things. I find it interesting that the Pope's summer residence is Castel Gandolfo.
Yes, indeed. And I don't think I actually don't think it's a coincidence, but obviously we can't prove that. But
I agree. I think whether it was intentional or not, I think there was something in Tolkien's mind that did that. Also, two things.
Right, also, but Father, on that, because we could go on forever here, but on that, when the actual coronation of the king, right? Frodo, the Christ figure, hands the crown to Gandalf, robed in white, who then places it on the head of the king. In that particular moment, in terms of Catholic political philosophy, Gandalf is in the role of the Pope. It's Charlemagne, etc.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I began reading this before it was popular at all. I mean, I was in Germany studying, and I could barely write my thesis, but next to the library part I was in with theology was the Anglistic, the English books. And I was reading Lewis, and then I saw in the back of one of Lewis' books, he's mentioning Tolkien, words that pierce like a sword and burn like fire or something like that. Who's this guy? So I got Lord of the Rings. I started reading it, and I would spend about a half hour in the morning on my thesis, and the rest of the day reading Lord of the Rings. And I would get on the bus, and reading it, get off the bus, walk to the apartment. I wouldn't stop reading it. But I didn't know anything about Tolkien. I said, this man has got to be Catholic. I mean, only a Catholic could have written a book like this. And I found out later he was Catholic. I got that same quote that you mentioned. It was a letter to a Jesuit, by the way, to Father Murray, where he said that. But to me, it was like a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope, you got all these pieces of broken glass in it, but you turn it, and it makes these figures.
Right.
I think what Tolkien has in his book, he's got the fullness of Catholic faith, but he's broken it up into little pieces and rearranged it. So he's not preaching about the Catholic faith, but I mean, it's everywhere permeating the book.
Right. And by the way, I actually got the first time we read Tolkien. It's a bit of a conversation stopper when I'm giving talks on the Lord of the Rings, and someone asked me the question, when did you first read the Lord of the Rings? Because my answer is during my second prison sentence. So if people have no idea about my past, that's a bit of a gobsmacker.
Yeah, I would say so, an eye popper for sure.
My last comment on this is that you didn't mention him here, but and I don't know, is it pronounced Gamgee or Gamgee?
I always say Gamgee, and I'm the only authority that matters, Father.
Okay, so Sam.
Well, G is usually soft when it precedes an E.
Like geek. Okay. Anyway, but I mean, you mentioned there's many. Christ has many faces, in Lord of the Rings, and I think Sam Gamgee is one of them.
When he carries Frodo the rest of the way, I mean, he's carrying a man who's now a hobbit, you know, utterly broken down by weakness of carrying
Yeah.
this ring, and he can no longer carry it himself, and Sam picks him up. I mean, yes, that's Christ.
This is good. Well, this is we finished this wonderful book by Joseph Pearce, Literature, What Every Catholic Should Know. If you're watching and haven't read it, well, go get it and then watch this again. But this is a great little handbook to get you started or to keep you going in understanding Catholic literature. We are now going to turn to next week.
Yeah.
I've got the book right here.
That was the next thing, obviously, because we're switching books. We finished discussion literature. So next week, and see Vivian's holding up there, is Tim Gray's book on Peter. And so if we can make a point, perhaps between now and next week, of reading the first 3 chapters.
Right.
We're going to spend 3 weeks on the book as the triumvirate, Father Fezio, Vivian, and I. And then we are going to have, hopefully, Tim Gray, the author, here for our 4th week discussing this. So it's going to be exciting. So please try to read the forward of Father Fezio and the first 3 chapters between now and next Monday.
All right.
So thanks for joining us.
Thank
God
you.
bless you all. See you next week.